Okay, let's unpack this. We are doing a deep dive into fire safety in, well, one of the most densely packed vertical cities in the world, Hong Kong.
Hmm.
And this is unfortunately prompted by a recent, just a truly awful catastrophe, the high-rise residential fire in Taipo's Wang Fuk Court. This is just in November of 2025.
And the scope of that tragedy is genuinely shocking. That fire, it resulted in 44 deaths, with 279 people reported missing.
Wow.
It's a grim, just a heartbreaking new record for mass casualties in Hong Kong's peacetime building fires.
It surpasses a historical marker that we absolutely have to examine today, the 1996 Garley Building fire.
Yeah.
But before we even get to Garley, it's worth stepping back for a second and recognizing that this pattern, it's not new. Hong Kong has a long, tragic history with fire in these dense environments.
That historical context is so essential. I mean, think
Yeah.
about the 1918 Happy Valley Racecourse fire.
Okay.
You have 614 people die when a temporary grandstand collapsed, knocked over some food stalls, and ignited bamboo matting that was everywhere.
600 people. Over a century ago. And what links that 1918 disaster to, 1996 and now 2025?
It's that lethal combination of density, high occupancy, and incredibly rapid vertical spread.
Right. Aided by combustible materials. Whether it was bamboo matting 100 years ago or, as we'll see, flammable foam today.
It's the same persistent vulnerability.
So our mission today is really to trace this cycle. We're going to use the 1996 Garley Building fire as our foundational case study to understand why Hong Kong's building laws had to change so fundamentally.
And then we'll look at what this horrific 2025 tragedy reveals about the challenge of actually enforcing those modern standards,
Yeah.
especially during construction and renovation.
Exactly. What were the critical failures in the past, and why didn't these modern regulations prevent the next worst-case scenario?
That's the question we need to answer.
So let's start with the precedent that changed everything. The Garley Building fire of 1996. This was a 16-story commercial building built back in '75, which means it predated the laws requiring things like sprinkler systems in commercial high-rises.
So it was inherently vulnerable. A disaster's just waiting for an ignition source.
And that source came on November 20, 1996. It was traced back to welding during an elevator renovation.
And this is where that devastating chain of errors really begins. The sources all point to a stray piece of hot metal, a bit of slag, falling from the 13th floor.
And it landed where?
Down in the second floor lift lobby, igniting some combustible debris. But the critical failure wasn't just the spark, it was the structural setup.
Right, because the building had 4 elevator shafts, but 2 of them had their elevators completely removed for the renovation.
Exactly. And in their place, contractors had put up temporary bamboo scaffolding inside the shaft.
Inside the shaft. And to make it worse, they'd taken off the fire-resistant elevator doors.
They removed them to allow more light for the welders. So you had a fire starting at the bottom of 2 open, empty shafts that were lined with highly combustible bamboo.
You essentially created a giant internal chimney.
That is the perfect description. That combination, open shafts, burning bamboo, no fire doors, it created a massive chimney effect.
Drawing air upward.
Violently. It caused the flame front to accelerate vertically, bypassing entire floors and shooting straight up to the 13th and 15th levels.
And then the human element just poured gasoline on it. The documentation shows staff at a company, China Arts and Crafts, had actually wrapped plastic around the smoke detectors.
Why would they do that?
Because the welding kept triggering what they called nuisance alarms.
So they silenced the very system designed to save them. When the real fire started, everyone just ignored the bells. They figured it was a welding again.
And the welders themselves, the investigation found they were using their equipment on the highest setting, which was against building codes.
Which explains how that piece of metal was still hot enough to start a fire after falling 10 stories.
This sounds less like an accident and more like a total operational breakdown.
It was.
Yeah.
And the consequences were just horrific, especially on the 15th floor. That was occupied by Chow Sang Seng Jewelry. Employees were trapped in this thick, superheated smoke. Panic sets in and, desperate for air, they rush to open the windows.
And this is where the physics of fire turned absolutely lethal, the backdraft.
Precisely. That sudden rush of fresh oxygen feeding a heat-starved fire, it caused all the accumulated smoke and gases in the hallway to flash over violently.
And the force of that.
It shattered the glass office doors. Doors that, by the way, had replaced the original fire-resistant ones. The entire floor was engulfed almost instantly. 22 people died in that one unit.
Wow. The details from the aftermath are just gut-wrenching. I mean, the heat was so intense, DNA testing was needed to identify victims. Some remains were melted into the floors and walls.
Just silhouettes left behind.
Yeah.
The source material notes some victims were only identifiable by an object they were holding, like a mobile phone.
And the tragedy extended to the first responders. This was a 5-alarm fire, the highest level. But the fire department ladders at the time could only reach the 8th floor.
Leaving hundreds strapped above it.
Yeah, and rescue from the air didn't work either. They brought in a Black Hawk helicopter to the roof, but it had to leave pretty quickly. They were worried the rotor wash was actually making the fire worse.
And a firefighter was lost. He plunged from the 5th floor into one of those open elevator shafts because of zero visibility smoke.
So the Garley disaster, it became the definitive benchmark for a regulatory failure.
The change had to be immediate and radical. After the fire, the governor urged lawmakers to fast-track a bill to upgrade fire safety standards for 500 premises right away.
Because a post-fire census revealed it wasn't just Garley, was it?
No.
Yeah.
It found 723 commercial blocks, many over 20 years old, were deemed potential death traps.
Hundreds of buildings with similar risks.
Exactly. And that led to profound, lasting change. By June 1998, regulations were amended, mandating fire sprinklers in older high-rises. And by 2001, the department formed a dedicated, specialized rescue team for these kinds of fires.
Which brings us to the modern blueprint, the Code of Practice for Fire Safety in Buildings. It's been refined over the years, but it rests on 3 core objectives, right?
That's right. It's a layered defense. First, means of escape, getting people out safely.
Okay.
Second, fire-resistant construction, which is about containment, the FRR. And third, means of access for firefighting and rescue, the EVA, making sure the fire service can actually get in and do their job.
Get people out, keep the fire in, get firefighters in. Simple in principle. So how does the code address that rapid vertical spread we saw in Garley? How does it ensure containment?
That's where the concept of compartmentation is so critical. You have to think of the building not as one big space, but as a series of separate fire zones or compartments.
Using fire-rated walls and floors.
Right, with high fire resistance ratings. The goal is to separate areas based on their hazard, their use classification. So you wouldn't have a high-risk manufacturing floor right next to a residential zone without a very serious certified fire break between them.
So a restaurant kitchen, for example, has to be completely isolated from an office corridor. If a fire starts in the kitchen, it stays in the kitchen for a minimum amount of time.
Precisely. And the modern code combines these passive provisions, the fire doors, the walls, with active provisions, like sprinklers and detectors. The combination is designed to make a Garley-style vertical spread virtually impossible.
But Hong Kong buildings are often, incredibly complex, unique. The code can't just be a simple checklist for everything.
And it isn't. That's where engineering flexibility comes in. You have the standard rules, the prescriptive deemed to comply provisions.
The checklist.
The checklist. But if a building's scale or complexity means you can't meet those specific rules, engineers can propose an alternative solution. They use a performance-based approach, basically proving through detailed modeling that their unique design achieves the same level of safety.
So the intent of the law is never sacrificed. It's a sophisticated, layered system built specifically to prevent another Garley. Yet, almost 3 decades later, we have the Tai Po fire in 2025, with a much higher casualty count. So why did all these hard-won safety layers fail?
That is the crucial question. Garley was a failure of internal management and design in an old commercial building. Tai Po was a failure of external management during renovation in a modern, massive residential complex.
Wang Fuk Court, home to nearly 5,000 residents, many of them elderly.
Right. And the fire didn't start inside the sprinkler-protected, compartmented area.
It started on the outside, on the skin of a 32-story block.
Exactly, on the scaffolding. The spread was aided by sharp winds and, critically, by the temporary materials wrapped around the building.
What material?
Investigators found large amounts of highly flammable foam sheets, styrofoam panels, believed to have been used by the contractor.
And the sources note that the traditional bamboo scaffolding and the construction netting, the very things we know are combustible, they turned into fast-burning ladders of flame,
Carrying the fire quickly across the exterior of the high-rise.
bypassing all the internal fire resistance.
It completely circumvented the system. All that compartmentation, all the fire-rated doors and internal sprinklers, they suddenly become irrelevant because the fire is raging on the outside.
But surely the modern code of practice anticipated this kind of risk during renovation.
Oh, it absolutely did.
Yeah.
This brings us to the operational side of the code, which is just as important as the design side. It mandates a fire safety management plan, often called Part F.
Okay.
And that plan requires constant vigilance, maintenance, training to make sure fire safety provisions are in good working order at all times.
And during a massive renovation like the one at Tai Po, that management plan becomes even more critical.
It becomes the only defense. The specific renovation rules, for example, they mandate that fire-rated doors must be kept closed, exit routes kept clear, and critically, that flame-retardant sheetings must be used for all scaffoldings.
And the contractors, by allegedly using highly flammable foam and styrofoam, seem to have just flagrantly violated that.
That's why the investigation is so serious. 3 men directors and an engineering consultant from the firm were arrested on suspicion of manslaughter for gross negligence.
So this isn't just a code violation.
No, this is a failure of safety management leading directly to mass death.
It just highlights this huge gulf between regulatory intent and real-world compliance during temporary works. I mean, engineers design these towers using design fires to plan for worst-case scenarios, right?
They do, but those plans are based on expected fuel loads inside the building.
Yeah.
And this data shows just how catastrophic introducing unexpected fuel loads can be. A fire engineer might design a system for a typical office fire with sprinklers to handle about 1.5 megawatts of heat release.
Which is a huge fire, but it's manageable.
Right. But a retail shop without sprinklers has to be designed for a fire that could reach 27.5 megawatts.
Wow, that's a massive difference.
That 26 megawatt difference shows you the power of the active suppression system. But when you wrap the outside of a building in thousands of square feet of highly flammable styrofoam, you create a fire load that just completely exceeds any design basis.
Yeah.
It overwhelms the entire safety framework in minutes.
So the lesson isn't that the post-1996 laws were flawed. It's that the temporary construction materials and the management overseeing them created a completely new hazard that attacked the building from the outside.
That is the definitive takeaway. The 1996 disaster forced huge changes in permanent protections. But the 2025 disaster shows that negligence and, using cheap, flammable materials remain lethal vulnerabilities, especially during the chaos of a large-scale renovation.
So what does this all mean for us, for you listening, for people who live and work in these dense, high-rise cities?
I think it means that regulatory intent, as strong and sophisticated as that post-1996 code is only as strong as its enforcement on the ground. The safety systems we rely on, the fire ratings, the sprinklers, they're often invisible until they fail. But the most basic failures, like using the wrong material on scaffolding or wrapping a detector in plastic, they reveal the single most important barrier to tragedy is often just the vigilance and integrity of the people overseeing the process.
So here's a thought for you to mull over. These mandatory safety standards are written to ensure a building is safe for its entire life. But the difference between life and death often comes down to the quality of temporary materials used, and whether someone decided to cut a corner during a renovation. How do we ensure that these temporary standards are enforced with the same rigor as the permanent structural integrity of the building itself? Because the next great building tragedy will likely involve something temporary, not something permanent.